Hey students, today I'm going to introduce you to the quadratic formula and the discriminant. We have been talking a lot about quadratic functions. Remember, quadratic functions are those functions that look like this, and sometimes they're in other forms, but basically when they're graphed, they form a parabola that sometimes opens up and sometimes opens down. So the discriminant is what we're going to focus on today in preparation for the quadratic formula, which you will learn tomorrow. Quadratic formula, I'm going to copy down here in just a minute, but just so you know, the quadratic formula is something we use to solve quadratic equations. Now, what it means when we are solving a quadratic equation, it means we are finding the x-intercepts of the parabola. So in other words, we're looking for where the parabola hits the x-axis. Those would be the solutions. You already know these by a couple of other words. You know them by the word zeros or roots, but they also are known as solutions, and we have to know how to solve them. So the quadratic formula, remember we're finding x-intercepts, so it starts off with x equals. And I'm going to say it first, but there's actually a song that I'll teach you to help you remember it. I actually had a student tonight that messaged me, and she's 30 years old, and she said, believe it or not, I still remember the quadratic formula, and then a bunch of, because we learned it to a song, and a bunch of other students of mine in the past were like, same, 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 same. They all remember it. So I promise you if you learn it to a song, it will help. So the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over the product of 2a. I know that seems funny right now, but you are going to know it. So in our quadratic formula, you notice that we have a radical, which can either mean that we'll end up with perfect square numbers, or we could end up with numbers where the number doesn't come out of the radical, therefore it is irrational. Or we could end up getting a number we can take the square root of altogether, like maybe the square root of 25, and then that becomes 5 and there's no radical. But very important is this part here, b squared minus 4ac. In fact, it is the discriminant. So feel free at any time, by the way, to pause the video. I do recommend that you copy these notes down. It will help you when you are doing your practice on Delta Math. So again, the discriminant is the value of the radicand. Remember, we just reviewed this in your last two lessons, that the radicand is the part under the radical. So the value of this radicand tells us some interesting things. First of all, this here says if D, and notice that I'm using D to refer to discriminant so we don't have to keep writing it out. But if our D value is less than 0, meaning it's negative, then we are going to end up with two imaginary roots. Remember, we just reviewed imaginary numbers as well, like square roots of negative numbers, which ended up having I in them. So what happens there is if this b squared minus 4ac, when we calculate it, ends up being a negative number, it means that our parabola will not hit the x-axis at all when we graph that quadratic function. So it might open up or it might open down, but what will happen is it will not hit the x-axis. Therefore, they will not have real solutions. And remember, opposite of real is imaginary. Next, if our D is equal to 0, then that means we would end up taking the square root of 0, which just equals 0. And when that happens, we will have one real repeated root. Now what that means graphically is that our parabola will sit on the x-axis and it will only touch the x-axis once. Or, it could open down as well and just hit the x-axis one time. Okay? If our D value is greater than 0, we know on a number line that any number greater than 0 is positive. So if we calculate our b squared minus 4ac and it comes out to be a positive number, then we will have two real roots. Remember, real numbers we can see they might be rational, they might be irrational, they might be integers, but if our value for our discriminant is positive, we will have 2 real roots. And you can also verify that by going to y equals and graphing your quadratic equation, and it should hit 2 different times. So where in the heck do we get this b squared minus 4ac to actually find the number? It comes from the y equals ax squared plus bx plus c, meaning a is your quadratic coefficient, b is your linear coefficient, and c is your constant. So remember, we know things about these already, right? That if our a value is positive, our parabola opens up. If our a value is negative, our parabola opens down. We should also remember that our constant term always equals the y-intercept, so where it hits the y-axis. But we are going to be using these 3 numbers in our quadratic equations. Now, what you should always see, I'm going to flip my page here, is that the equation is equal to 0. So if you need to pause the video, feel free to pause it at this time. So the discriminant, again, is b squared minus 4ac. And again, our ax squared plus bx plus c should be equal to 0. So notice that this is already in this form. Every now and then you'll see a quadratic equation where the terms are in a different order. As long as you have a quadratic, meaning the x squared term, the linear term, meaning x to the first, and your constant, meaning a number by itself, then you have these 3 values. Just another thing that might be important, if you don't see a value, like say this equation was just 2x squared plus 3, then our a value would equal 2, and because our constant term is always the number without a variable, c equals 3. So what would you plug in for b? A 0. You would need to plug in b for 0 because the term would be missing. So we're going to take this formula here, b squared minus 4ac, and we are going to calculate with it. So I'm going to show you on the Calculator X app as well as on a graphing calculator. So I'm going to get my phone ready here with my Calculator X app. I'll keep that handy. So b squared minus 4ac, things we need to know. First, you should always define that your a value in this case is 2. I'm sorry, that was really bright, hard to see. Here, your b value is -1. Understand that if you do not see a number in front of x, there is an understood 1, and that the sign belongs to that number. So our c value will equal our constant, which is 3. And we're simply going to write b squared minus 4ac and then plug it in the calculator to find that value. So one thing I want you to be conscious of is that when you do b squared minus 4ac, that your b needs to be in parentheses. And this is especially important when you type it in the calculator or your graphing calculator or phone app. So this would be -1 squared minus 4. So we always keep that minus 4. And then our a value is 2, and our c value is 3. And all we're going to do now is plug it in. So again, with the Calculator X, what's my phone doing? What's it doing? I don't need it. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and plug it in and zoom in just a little bit so maybe you can see. Maybe it won't be too, might be too bright. All right. So right here on the home screen, I'm going to do left parent. Remember, parent is singular for parentheses. So left parent, -1, close your parentheses, minus 4 times the a value, which is 2, times the c value, which is 3. Just like that. Oh, no, not just like that, because I sure forgot my square. My apologies. Left parentheses, -1, close it, then square it by hitting the x squared button right here, minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 3. And we get a value of -23. And again, if I were doing it here on my graphing calculator, make sure y'all can see that okay. Negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3. And we get negative 23. Same thing. So what I also want you to keep in mind, and this is going to be pertinent really for tomorrow's lesson, is that when we look at this discriminant value, it tells us information. So if we go back here to our notes, if our discriminant is a negative value, we're going to get 2 imaginary roots. So I'm just going to come over here and write 2 imaginary, and abbreviate it that way, roots. So again, if it's negative, 2 imaginary, 0, 1 real repeated root, which means it sits on the x-axis. And if it's positive, we're going to get 2 real roots. So we're just going to move forward a little bit quicker now. Here, our a value is 4, our b value is 12, and our c value is 9. I am not going to write it out if you can see it. What is going to be important, however, is like in example 3, make sure you're picking up negatives. So because these are positives, it's less to worry about. So again, my a value is 4, my b is positive 12, and my c is positive 9. So back to my formula, b is 12. So I'm going to put 12 in parentheses squared minus 4 times my a value, which is 4, times my c value, which is 9. And I'm just going to go right to my calculator, clear out my former problem, and do that. Sorry, I know it's turning bright when I do that. I'm hoping y'all can see that okay. So parentheses 12, close parentheses, squared, minus 4 times 9. That's it. That's all I'm asking you to do today. So equals 0. So what does it mean when our discriminant comes out to equal 0? It means we're going to have 1 real repeated root. 1 real repeated root. And lastly, for example 3 here, before I show you how to do problem 6 through 10 on Delta Math. So here, keep in mind that if there is not a coefficient in front of your variable here in any spot, your a value is going to equal 1. Here, your b will equal a negative 6, and your c will equal negative 7. So b squared, it's super important to put these negatives in, minus 4 times 1 times c, which is negative 7. Again, if you were to put a positive 7 here instead of negative 7 because you ignored that minus, it would be wrong. So let's do that. Again, check it over. Negative 6 squared minus 4 times a times c. So I'm going to, again, type it in. Negative 6 in parentheses squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7. And I get negative 1,000. Oh, that was too big. My apologies. Negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7. I think it's a little harder to hit the keys on the phone. Negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7. All right, I've got that right now. So it's 64. So here our discriminant is 64. Because it is positive, remember if it's positive, we're going to have 2 real roots, which means if we were to graph this equation, like if I go to y equals and type that in, it's going to hit the x-axis 2 times. So I'm just going to come over here and write 2 real roots. That's just going to help you with tomorrow's lesson. All you have to do on Delta Math today is identify this discriminant. It is a very important part of how we do problems on, or how we find solutions. So before moving on to show you how to do 6 through 10, I'm just going to go ahead and flip over to your quiz, which is 8, not quiz, your assignment, which is 8, the discriminant. And if this was what you were looking for, or looking at, rather, I'm just going to go ahead and show you how to do number 1. So it says, what is the discriminant of the quadratic equation of, let me flip some paper because we should write it down. Until you get good. Sometimes you can just, once you get good at it, you can just start putting stuff in your calculator. So my a value is negative 1, my b value is 2, and my c value is negative 3. So again, I'm going to write those values down. It's already set equal to 0, so I can go ahead and identify those values and plug them in my calculator. I'm going to switch back here to my document camera. So this is what I wrote. This was my equation. My A value was -1. My B value is 2. My C value is 3. Once you get really good at this, you really can just go straight to putting in your calculator. So parentheses, my B value is 2, so B squared minus 4 times A times C. Just like that. 2 squared minus 4. I'm trying to make it a little clearer for you. I'm sorry. There you go. Hopefully that's a little bit better. Oops, don't want to hit that. So again, B squared minus 4 times A times C. And I get -8. So since my discriminant is -8, we're going to go back here to Delta Math and type in choose, because the first 5 are multiple choice, -8, and submit our answer. All right, and we're good. And even here, it's going to give you an explanation. It says, what's the discriminant? Here's your A, your B, and your C, your formula, plugging it into the formula, and then it says type it in your calculator. So again, if you get stuck, it's on here on Delta Math as well. So remember, when you look at these problems, you also have watch help video. So you can always just click on that if you're like, I don't know what she's talking about. And it's going to go through, here's an equation, identify ABC, plug it in, and then type in your calculator. But certainly we can just use the tools that we've already got. The next thing I'm going to do is show you how to do a problem like number 6 that you're going to have, which looks like this. So if you look at this, you might go, that does not look like the other problems. So I'm going to help you out and walk you through that process. So back to my page of notes here. If you need to pause, you're welcome to do so at this time. It says, before finding the discriminant, the equation must be set equal to 0. Move terms to the opposite side using inverse operations. Remember, inverse operations are like, if you see a number being added, you need to subtract it. That's the inverse operation. Subtracting is the inverse of adding and vice versa. Multiplying is the inverse of dividing, etc. But you'll just either have to add or subtract. So your job is to get it in the form ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So I've got 3 examples here that look very much like the problems from 6 through 10 on Delta Math. So if you take a look at this one here, you notice you've got a quadratic, linear, and constant term, but it's equal to another constant. The easiest thing is to take this and move it. And if you see a -3, to move it, we need to turn it into 0. And we can do that by the inverse operation. The inverse of -3 is +3. But when I add a constant, I can only add the 3 to another constant. So I can't add a 3 to 12x, and I can't add a 3 to 2x squared because they are not like terms. If I draw a line, now this -3 plus 3 cancels because it equals 0. And then I can bring my terms down. 7 plus 3 is 10. And I can bring down my quadratic and linear terms. So 2x squared plus 12x plus 10. And then finding my discriminant just like we did before. A is 2, B is 12, and now C is 10. So C is not 7, it's actually 10. You have to set the equation equal to 0 first. And then once you know that, hopefully at this point you're catching on to B squared minus 4AC. So if you do B squared, that would be 12. So 12 squared minus 4 times the A value times the C value. Ta-da! And you get 64. So I just want to show you a couple other variations that you'll see on there as well. Your job is to get good at manipulating equations. Notice we already have the quadratic term over here. So we've got a quadratic, linear, constant equal a linear and a constant. It's easier to move these 2 over here than it is to take these 3 and move it over here. So I'm going to move the 4x and minus 5 by placing them under the like term on the opposite side, but we have to use inverse operations. Notice if you see 4x, there's not a negative, which means it is positive. To move a positive 4x, you need to subtract 4x. If I subtract 4x on the right side of the equation, I must balance it by subtracting 4x on the left. Now that cancels out and equals 0. But I still have a minus 5. To move a minus 5, I need to add 5. But I can only add 5 to another constant. Now that cancels out. Draw a line, and I'm just going to bring down my constant term. Negative 15x minus 4x is, don't be shy. If you need to, use your calculator. Negative 15 minus 4 is negative 19. So the coefficient here, negative 19x, and then negative 7 plus 5, feel free to use a calculator, minus 2, is equal to 0. Now your A value is negative 1, your B value is negative 19, and your C value is negative 2. And that is what you plug into B squared minus 4AC to find your discriminant. Next, for example 6, you're going to see a problem on Delta Math where you have a quadratic, linear, and constant equal to a quadratic term. So it's going to be the easiest to move one term to the opposite side than it is to move these 3 over here. So we're going to take this minus 3x squared or negative 3x squared and add 3x squared because negative 3 plus 3 is 0 and it goes away. So if I add 3x squared on the right, I must also add 3x squared on the left. Kind of running out of room here, but and then we just do the math. Negative 8x squared plus 3x squared. Negative 8 plus 3, if you're not great with integers, is negative 5x squared. Bring this down, plus 17x, and bring this down, minus 100, and it's now equal to 0. So now we have it in the form, just like we're required to. Ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So if I were asked to find the discriminant, I would go, oh, b is 17. So b squared minus 4 times a, which is negative 5, times c, which is negative 100. And press enter, and it's a negative value, negative 1711. And that's all you have to do. So just want to make sure you're clear on that. So I'm going to do one with you. I'm going to go to Google Chrome, and we're going to do number 6 together. Was this 6? Yeah, so I'm going to go see problem. So it says, for the following quadratic equation, find the discriminant. So I'm going to write this down on paper. This is exactly what I would expect you as students to do, is copy the problem down. Don't miss any terms and don't miss any signs. So here's my equation that we just have. This is problem number 6 on Delta Math. So I'm already giving you 2 answers. You've got a quadratic, linear, constant, equal a quadratic. So I need to, if this is minus 6x, I'm going to add 6x, or excuse me, minus 6x squared, I'm going to add 6x squared. So just keep in mind, if this was positive, I would subtract. If it's negative, we add, because we have to make it equal 0. So negative 6x squared adds 6x squared to 0. So I'm going to come down here and combine. Negative 11 plus 6 is negative 5x squared. And then I'm just going to bring these down. Plus 90x minus 160. And then I'm going to do my b squared minus 4ac because your job is to find the discriminant. So b is 90 minus 4 times my a value is negative 5. And my c value is negative 160. That's a big number, but we're just using our calculator, so no big deal. In parentheses, though, be cautious of that. Put your b squared in parentheses there. So 90 squared minus 4 times negative 5 times negative 160 is 4,900. So I'm just going to go back in here to Delta Math and type in 4900, hit submit answer, and I am good to go. But again, they're working all this out for you here on the screen as well. So super important, if you did not do Monday's lesson on taking the square root of negative radicands, you really, really need to do that so that you can be able to put that skill plus the discriminant together to be able to solve quadratic equations, which is what we're going to do tomorrow. That right there, we're going to be solving for the x-intercepts or imaginary roots tomorrow. So yeah, so make sure that you've done this lesson and the lesson prior. All right, thank you very much. Give us a text or email if you need any help.